everyone. Welcome to Art of the News, a comics journalism exhibition. My name is Forrest, and I'm joined here today by my co-host, Deb Sanyal.
Hey everyone, we are incredibly grateful to have as our guests for today's interview, nonfiction comics creator, educator, and editor, Andy Warner. How are you doing, Andy?
I'm great. Yeah, it's a lovely foggy morning here in Berkeley.
All right, starting with the interview, how did you go from completing a graduate degree in comics to becoming a comics journalist and nonfiction artist? And why do you think that comics are an effective form for telling nonfiction stories?
Sure. Well, I had experimented a little bit with nonfiction before going to grad school. I went to grad school at the Center for Cartoon Studies, and I'd done I think maybe one or two. I'd done a memoir comic, a little mini, and I'd done a little history comic. But while I was actually at school at CCS, I did a mini comic about the time that I was living in Beirut in 2005, when Rafik Hariri was assassinated and the government fell, and there was a great response from the students, the other students in the crit sessions, and it was a story that was really important to me, and delving into it was a really interesting experience. And so that actually kind of set me on the path. I had gone to grad school thinking I would do fiction, and then I realized I was really good at nonfiction, and I actually got more out of doing it than I ever did out of working in fiction. And so I just swerved from there. And while I was still in school, I actually started doing freelance assignments for Slate. This was in the early days of the Arab uprisings in 2011. And so I did a few things actually while I was still in school, and then immediately when I graduated, that became my focus, was doing a lot of nonfiction work, basically, a lot of comics journalism. That was my bread and butter during those years because it was easy to get assignments. And then I would do nonfiction webcomics that were more history-based and things like that.
You've been named as instrumental in creating the transnational and really heterogeneous network of artists that contribute to the NIB, or before that, Irene. Can you tell us about that process, both how you meet so many different kinds of artists and then how you get them involved in nonfiction comics?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the amazing things about comics is that it's still sort of a small world, and especially nonfiction comics, but comics in general. I mean, there's people all over the world that love comics and read them, especially, these there's different traditions of comics, like people will get into like American Underground comics or whatever, and there's sort of niche things, and that fandom exists everywhere. And so wherever you go, you can find these communities of people, and a lot of times some of them are making mini comics. And so that was an experience that I had just growing up, moving around as a kid, meeting people that were into comics. And then it really sort of bloomed again when I went to Lebanon. Well, not while I was there in 2005, but the year after, via email, I was introduced to a collective of artists that was just forming called Samandal. And it was founded by these 4 cartoonists. Well, one was more sort of an animator. But they, from the get-go, wanted to publish this anthology in 3 different languages, in Arabic, in French, and in English, with artists from as many different places as they could. So there was artists from America, artists from Lebanon, artists from France, all over the place, really from the get-go. And so actually through them, I immediately, early on in my career, like 2007, had access to a really international community of cartoonists that were all talking with each other and getting published in this anthology. And then when I went to grad school, that model was really an inspiration for Irene, which was really fiction focused. Again, because that's what I had gone to grad school thinking I would do. And then meanwhile, this sort of nonfiction scene was brewing in the background with the help of people like Matt Bors and Aaron Polgreen, and all these early publications like Symbalia and the NIB were coming together. And when I started getting more heavily involved in the editorial side of the NIB, I brought this huge network that had sort of snowballed with me at that point through working with these two other very internationally focused publications. Like the last issue of Irene that we put out before it imploded, we had a cartoonist from every continent, including Antarctica, in it. So both with Samandal and then Irene, and then with the NIB, there was always this really explicitly international focus to try to connect communities of cartoonists that exist in all these different places and can kind of get siloed because of language or whatever. But in the age of Facebook and the global order of everybody having to learn English, it's easier than you think to get everybody drawing comics in the same publications.
So can you describe for us your process for reporting and how you approach a story that you plan to draw?
Sure. Well, first, the most important thing is thinking about where you plan to have it, especially, if you want it to actually be something that you finish, which is important when you're trying to work as a freelancer, a journalist, whatever. So thinking about where it's going to end up in the audience is really important. And then that shapes the pitch. So you're kind of thinking about all this stuff before you even come to an editor with it. And then the basic idea of that is why this is interesting to you, right? Because there's a whole world out there, a billion things could be interesting. The making of a chair could be interesting. I have a whole sort of side career out of making interesting things out of boring things. It's like a passion of mine. I've written a bunch of books about this. And it's the same principle. You're sort of like finding the fascination in it and then explaining that fascination to somebody else. So that starts with the editor that you're pitching to. You have to be able to hook them. You're like, I want to write a story about the history of making this chair. I'm going to interview these two people because I've already found a couple sources, and here's the story hook that makes it interesting. So you kind of come to it with this idea. And the way you get those ideas is just looking around and being aware, listening to things, talking to people, remembering stories, and then once something catches your attention, digging into it deeper. And then after that, once somebody's bid on a story, I generally will sort of write out a skeleton of it first that I think that it could go, and then I'll start doing interviews. And that skeletal structure is really subject to change. It's basically just like a foundational idea that guides my interviews that then often changes completely. Once I have the audio from the interviews and reference photos that I take if I'm able to do them in person or do a site visit, which has been harder over the last year and a half, obviously. But you process those. There's a ton of great AI transcription software out there these days. Otter.ai is the one that I've used in the past, but there's like dozens, and they're all great. AIs are good at this point. They're going to take all of our jobs. But you get the transcriptions, then you break it up into story chunks, and you have this one long sort of talk that has unspooled between you and the person. What I would really suggest as you're interviewing is that you actually have a little notebook alongside and you timestamp interesting stuff. So as I'm talking to you, I'm like looking at the interview clock on my phone and I'm like 10 minutes and 50 seconds in, we talked about chairs. And I just write chairs and write a timestamp. And that just reminds you that when you're looking at the AI transcription the next day, that you can go and look at, minute 10. This used to be a lot more vital when you had to transcribe it yourself because it would save you literally hours. Now it just saves you like 15 or 20 minutes, but it's still good to timestamp stuff because it lets you form the narrative in your head. And so basically an interview is a collection of narrative blocks, and you separate out the blocks and figure out how to arrange them into the skeletal structure, plug it all in, thumbnail it out, start drawing it, and then hopefully people read it. With a lot of editorial process back and forth. So I've worked both as a writer artist, as an artist for somebody else writing, and as an editor. So I've kind of worked in all of the roles. And the influence of the editor really is not to be understated. You should be sharing the stuff as you're working on it with the person who's expecting to publish it as often as you can, because you don't want a bad surprise and they don't want a bad surprise, especially with comics, because they're so much more hard to revise than prose is.
As a follow-up for that, when you teach your Stanford graphic novel project, what additional, you just gave a lot of advice. I don't know if there's any additional advice that you give your students for drawing nonfiction.
Sure, yeah, no, there's endless advice. The Stanford project is interesting because it's a group project. So they're working, some people are penciling, and then other people are inking, and everybody's doing everything. So a given page may be penciled by one person, inked by another, colored by another, written by another, and nobody specializes. And one of the things I try to teach with that program is getting a little good at everything, which I think is important, to be able to, just so that you don't get slowed down in the process. If you need to figure out how something looks in print, so you got to know InDesign a little bit. You need to know how to do quick digital edits, so you got to know Photoshop a little bit. If this stuff frustrates you, it's fine. You don't need to know everything, but just sort of familiarize your stuff enough that if something new comes at you, you don't get scared of it. And also don't get stuck in sort of technological ruts is a really important thing, to stay on top of things. I work digitally purely, and I have since 2007. I don't draw using pen and paper at all. I've switched technological tools a bunch of times since then. I've switched programs a bunch of times since then as the stuff has gotten better and better. And it's helped me work faster. And it's helped me stay on top of how to turn files into editors properly, how to not frustrate the publications that I'm working on, staying nimble and stuff like that. I mean, as a freelancer, you're your own boss, and you're also your own tech department and your own HR department. And that makes it a big, difficult job. And so you have to take care of yourself and make sure that you're doing all those things too, because nobody else is going to. That would be a piece of advice.
How much does your audience or platform kind of influence how you tell a story? When you're writing a piece for the UN, do you have a different set of goals than if you're writing for, let's say, BuzzFeed?
Yeah, massively. I have sort of a strange career that everything that I do is nonfiction, but I work in a lot of different spaces, everything from kids' books to like anti-genocide advocacy stuff for like NGOs, to journalism, objective, paid journalism work, and to memoir. And all of those have different sets of rules for them. They're all nonfiction spaces. Like a jokey history of a toothbrush is a nonfiction space, but it has different rules than a like serious treatment of political violence. And you can't just sort of like flippantly jump between them. And I've always had that. I always, from the early days of my career, was working on sort of weird, dark stuff at the same time as jokey, fun stuff. And so it's sort of like nonfiction code switching. You think about your audience, you think about how they would react to it, and you tailor it for that. And that doesn't mean censoring yourself in any way. You just put yourself in the shoes of the person reading it. Like, this person has picked up this thing to read it because you've managed to interest them in it. And it's fine to challenge them. You should challenge them, but challenge them on terms that they would understand and accept. So, don't write for, you can really write very complex stuff for kids, but you can't write for kids like you write for adults, and you can't write for adults like you write for kids. And you also can't write for screens like you can write for print. And there's all sorts of, one of the things that I really love about comics is that it's one of the more complicated art forms that you can work in. I guess mediums, right? So, and that applies to its use in fiction or nonfiction. So you're thinking about the page, it's a graphic design problem. You're thinking about the narrative, it's a story problem. You're thinking about how to draw the people, it's an art problem. You're thinking about journalistic integrity and ethics and all this stuff. And then actually thinking about the audience and the reception of the audience and the medium that it's appearing in, print, digital, size of panels, all this stuff that's like, it's the end of it, but it's kind of the most important stuff is that if you don't nail that, then nobody's going to give a shit.
Since you first began producing works of comics and journalism, what are some of the major changes that you've noticed in the field in terms of practices, tools, and approaches? And are there any that you're particularly excited about, or any that you're not so excited about?
Sure. One in the earlier days, so I mean, it's an old field, and people, and I came to it already at a point where people like Joe Sacco had been, huge in it for a decade and a half, and Sarah Glidden her star was on the rise. And so I didn't have to make the case to editors that comics journalism was a serious enterprise. And I'm wildly thankful for that. I mean, that was not having to expend the energy cutting the path and just walking down it is something that I'm so grateful for. Because all the editors that I was pitching to at places like Slate or Popular Science or things like that had, they'd read Safe Area Garage Day, they'd read Palestine. These things were assigned in university classes, like in the cool classes, sure, but like the idea that like comics were a serious way to treat nonfiction stories, including something as sacred as journalism, that had been breached, and like that editor, I didn't need to make that argument to editors. So that was one thing as I was starting my career. What's changed is that there's been sort of like there's been a lot more people doing it. Like when I started, I could count the number of people on one hand that I knew of. I mean, a lot of times you think that there's only a few people doing it, but they're just not connected. And that's one of the beautiful things about something like Samandal or the Nib or any of these things that exist to sort of bring people together, is that it can make people realize that they're not alone in a practice, in trying to create good, honest nonfiction work using the medium of comics. And then as those spaces became, entrenched and well-funded, so money started coming in from like VC places, which was weird. They thought they could turn a profit. Joke's on them, they didn't, but they accidentally funded a like beautiful and vibrant nonfiction comic scene that has outlasted the venture capital funding. I mean, outlasted it. So, it's like, it's not the golden days of a year and a half or 2 years ago when the Nib was rolling in money and we were putting out 4 issues of the print quarterly a year and 3 long form stories on the website a week. But all the people that were brought together during that era still know each other. The Nib still exists, and everybody's still making comics for the most part. I mean, people always come to comics and they always leave to comics, and the scene changes. But yeah, I guess what I've been lucky enough to be around for is that I was lucky enough to get there after you stopped having to make the argument for its existence. And then I was able to be around for actually watching it like come together into this really global scene where cartoonists from Australia, no cartoonists in Lebanon, no cartoonists in Finland, no cartoonists in South Africa, no cartoonists in Brazil, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, we hang out when we're at different conventions if people are able to travel internationally, and if they're not, things like Zoom exist.
So what lies ahead? What do you think of the...
Never asking that. No, go on, sorry.
I mean, both in terms of your own work as well as a kind of a future for comics journalism as a whole. Mm-hmm. What lies ahead for both the personal work as well as the field?
Sure. Well, one thing that's exciting is just that there's so many people that are kind of mid-career in it right now. and still a ton more in early career. And so the people that are in mid-career, the people that I came up with, like, you know, Matt Bors or Larry, Matty Lipchansky, the other people at the NIB, and all the people in that sort of first generation are all starting to do like big, interesting things. And then organs like the NIB and other places still exist and are publishing this generation of even younger cartoonists that are, and this was starting to happen with my generation cartoonists and the generation before me, but the generation that I'm teaching right now in my classes in Denmark and in Stanford is, I mean, they're a wholly different kind of cartoonist. Like it is I got to know comics in the 90s when it was associated with kind of nerdy white guys hanging out in like shops that were impenetrable to anybody outside of the fandom. And comics just looks different now. It's younger, it's browner, it's queerer, it's like it's this awesome landscape that kind of with every successive generation of people coming into comics in general, but nonfiction comics especially, because that's my little place that I get to watch this happen in. What people are writing about and what people are talking about and talking to each other about using the medium is changing. And that's in such early days still. I mean, it's like 15, 20 years of this. That's so young for an art form, that watching that grow and blossom and watching those people hit mid-career and late career is what's really exciting to me. You know, everything else, the planet will be consumed by flames, but you know, the Nibs brand is doom, and we flog that a lot. But there is a hope that I think is an undercurrent to a lot of what I do and what editorially we try to do at the NIB in terms of trying to bring people together to make amazing stuff that I still look forward to. Personally, I'm still making nonfiction comics. I have a book coming out in September of this year about animal domestication. And then I have another book coming out like next year or the year after about plant domestication. I'm writing right now a really long form journalism piece about living in along the volcano coast of Hawaii, where these cataclysms keep wiping out communities every like 30 to 50 years in this really devastating way, and how people rebuild from that. And yeah, I don't know, you just get interested about stuff and write stuff, and I don't have an end goal. I just do stuff until I stop.
Do you have any more advice that you would like to give to aspiring journalists?
It's always important to, well, so the most important advice is to be nice, of course. Like, you're going to have to, I can swear on this, right? You're gonna have to eat shit like super hard at several points in your career. And the important thing is to do that while smiling, and it sucks. And that this is true of not just comics journalism. It's true of any power dynamic, and the relationship between an editor and a writer is a power dynamic. And you have to kind of keep your editors happy to a certain point, because you depend on them for work and for them passing you along to other editors and recommending you. And I cannot tell you how much in the early days of my career, editors told me that they had recommended me to work with others because I was nice and easy to work with. This is a real thing that people told me, and that's meaningful. And so the biggest thing I could impart to any young journalist is to be easy to work with. It doesn't mean you have to be an easy person. It doesn't mean you have to be an easygoing person. It doesn't mean you don't have to hold your ground and like advocate for yourself and stake out your position and be honest and be ethical and be your own journalist. It just means like, if somebody gives you the edit that you don't want to get, and it makes you mad, don't respond then. Like, give it a few hours, respond then. If you're still mad, give it a few more hours and say you left your phone at the beach. Like, lie to your editors before you yell at them. So that's especially in the early parts of your career. That would be the biggest piece of advice. The other is recognize opportunity and work hard when it comes, because a lot of this is luck and chance and privilege, of course, but a lot of it's chance. Like you can work your ass off and not have anything come at you, and then you could be like walking down a sunny day and it lands in your lap. My first book came from an editor walking down the street from her offices and buying a mini comic in New York. I wasn't even in New York. I had just sent a copy to this place, and she bought it and was like, oh, this should be a book, and emailed me out of the blue. So send your stuff out there. And then when something like that happens, jump on it, recognize that it's an opportunity and jump on it and like get it around it, just don't let go. So that's the thing. There's no real paths. There's no like map to a successful career. There's no portfolio day where you go around to the magazines and show them your good work and get a pat on the head anymore. It's just like, get your stuff out there, throw out a ton of lines, be nice to everybody, and then when a line jiggles, like yank it.
It's very insightful. Thank you.
Yeah.
We are very thankful to you, Andy, for sharing very detailed and meaningful thoughts about your works, comics, and comic journalism. Do you have any last thoughts before we wrap up?
No, thanks. This has been great. Thanks for taking the time.
This has been amazing. Thank you so much.
Of course.
All right, I think we're gonna wrap up then and end our recording. Thank
Awesome.
you again for joining us, and we're very grateful for your presence.